The auditorium was buzzing that evening. The company's annual talent show was always meant to be lighthearted, a chance for employees to show skills beyond their work. Some did magic tricks, others danced, and a few even tried stand-up comedy. But this year, there was a rumor going around that had everyone whispering. Someone had put Sundar Pichai, the CEO himself, on the sign-up sheet. Not just for hosting, not for a speech, but for singing. Many believed it was a prank. Sundar was known for his calm leadership, his vision for the future of technology, and his humility. But singing, that was something no one had ever seen him do. The crowd laughed when his name was announced. A group of young engineers in the back exchanged knowing glances, whispering that it would be the highlight of the night to watch their CEO stumble. Some even bet on how long he would last before walking off stage. After all, Sundar wasn't the type to chase the spotlight. He was reserved, thoughtful, and careful with his words. Surely he would decline, laugh it off, and avoid embarrassment. But as the stage lights turned toward him, Sundar stood up slowly from his seat. Silence fell over the room. He smiled, adjusted his glasses, and walked calmly toward the stage. Each step he took made the air heavier, the laughter quieter, the whispers sharper. No one knew what was about to happen. Some expected him to refuse once he reached the microphone. Others thought he might joke about it, turning the prank back on whoever signed him up, but Sundar didn't look angry. He didn't look nervous either. Instead, he looked like a man carrying a quiet memory, something heavy but deeply personal. When he reached the microphone, he paused and looked out into the sea of faces. Hundreds of eyes were on him. The silence was almost painful. Finally, he spoke in a soft voice. "When I was young," he began, "my mother used to hum songs while cooking." Those were simple moments, but they stayed with me. The audience leaned forward. There was no humor in his tone, no sign that he would refuse. He was actually going to sing. The engineers in the back widened their eyes, suddenly realizing this wasn't going to be funny. Sundar took a breath, closed his eyes for a second, and then his voice filled the room. It wasn't loud, it wasn't perfect, but it was gentle and pure. The melody was simple, an old Hindi lullaby that carried the weight of love, sacrifice, and longing. The room froze. The same people who had been waiting to laugh now sat completely still. Some felt a strange warmth in their chest, as the words, though foreign to many, painted pictures of childhood, of mothers waiting late at night, of fathers working tirelessly, of families holding on through struggles, employees who had never once seen their CEO outside the lens of business now saw a human being, vulnerable yet strong, standing before them with nothing but his voice. Sundar's song wasn't about showing skill. It was about telling a story. Every note carried a piece of his past, and every word carried emotions that no resume or keynote could reveal. In the front row, a young intern who had once felt invisible. At work wiped away a tear. He thought about his own mother, who used to sing him to sleep after long shifts at the factory. A senior executive who had always believed success was only about power and strategy suddenly felt a lump in his throat. He thought about how disconnected he had become from his family, and those engineers in the back, their smiles faded. Shame crept over them as they realized the joke they had set up had turned into something extraordinary. The song ended, but the silence lingered. Sundar lowered his head for a moment, as if lost in a memory, then stepped back from the microphone. He didn't bow. He didn't smile. He simply stood still, waiting. Then it happened. Slowly at first. Then all at once, the audience rose to their feet. Applause thundered across the room, not because the singing was flawless, but because it was real, because it was honest. Because for the first time, they saw Sundar Pichai not just as a CEO, but as a man who carried love, humility, and resilience. In his heart. And just as the clapping reached its peak, Sundar glanced at the back of the room. His eyes caught the engineers who had put his name down as a joke. For a brief second, their faces drained of color. Had he known it was them? Would he call them out in front of everyone? Would he turn this into a moment of humiliation for them? Instead, Sundar adjusted the microphone again, and the crowd fell silent, eager for what he would say next. But there's something you all don't know, Sundar said softly, his eyes still on the back row. This song, it's not just a memory, it's a promise. And tonight, I want to tell you why. The room gasped. The applause faded into complete silence again. Everyone leaned in, waiting to hear the truth behind his words. But before Sundar could continue, the host of the event stepped forward, cutting him off to announce the next performance. The tension in the room shattered, leaving everyone restless and filled with unanswered questions. Sundar smiled politely, gave a small nod, and walked back to his seat. The secret he hinted at hung heavy in the air, and no one could focus on the next act. The engineers in the back whispered nervously, wondering if Sundar had planned something for them. The intern who had cried clutched his chest, desperate to know what promise the song carried. And the executives glanced at each other, uneasy, because they knew that when Sundar left something unfinished, it was never by accident. At night, people went home talking about the performance, but even more about the mystery. What was the promise behind the song? What was Sundar about to reveal before he was interrupted? Why did he look directly at the pranksters? No one slept peacefully that night, because they all knew this was just the beginning. Asterisk the night after the talent show, whispers filled the office hallways. Engineers who had been present couldn't stop replaying the moment in their minds, while those who weren't there felt like they had missed something legendary. The recording of Sundar's song spread quietly through private chats, not through official company channels, but almost secretly, as though people felt they were sharing something sacred, something too personal to post openly. Every replay of that song carried the same stillness that had settled over the auditorium. For the pranksters in the back row, however, the feeling was different. They were restless. One of them, a tall software engineer named Rishi, sat at his desk the next morning, unable to concentrate. He kept hearing Sundar's voice and seeing the way he had looked directly at them. He couldn't shake off the thought that Sundar knew exactly who signed him up. Another, Kavya, who had laughed the loudest when Sundar's name was announced, avoided eye contact with her team. The laughter from that night now echoed back like guilt dot in the executive wing. The reactions were heavier. The senior leaders had seen Sundar in countless meetings, handling crises, steering billion-dollar decisions. But they had never seen him so vulnerable, never heard him connect to something that wasn't numbers or vision or goals. Some executives even felt unsettled, because vulnerability was something they had long avoided in their own lives. It made them wonder if they had lost something human while chasing success. Sundar himself, however, moved through the office the next day as if nothing unusual had happened. He greeted employees with his usual calm tone, walked into meetings with quiet focus, and kept his soft smile. Yet, underneath that calmness, there was something stirring. His assistant noticed he paused at his desk more often than usual, staring at a small notebook he kept tucked inside his drawer. She had seen him open it only rarely, and whenever he did, his eyes seemed to carry the weight of decades. The mystery of the promise hung over everyone. At lunch tables, employees speculated wildly. Maybe he was going to announce some new program. One said, no. Another argued, it felt too personal, like it was about his family. But why look at those engineers? Maybe they reminded him of something. What if it was all planned? What if he wanted to test us? Each theory only deepened the sense that something bigger was hiding behind Sundar's words. That evening, as the building quieted, Sundar stayed behind in his office. The lights from the city outside glowed faintly through the tall glass windows. He opened a notebook from his drawer. Inside were pages filled with handwriting, not business notes or strategies, but memory stories about his childhood in Chennai, about his parents, about sacrifices that no one outside his family knew. He stopped at a page with a small stain on it, as if it had been touched by a tear long ago. The lullaby he had sung wasn't just any song. It was the one his mother used to hum when food was scarce, when his father worried about bills, when they struggled to keep hope alive. Sundar remembered nights when he and his brother shared a single meal, and his mother, though hungry herself, would smile and sing so they would feel safe. He remembered how that song became a shield, protecting them from despair, but there was something else. That lullaby was also tied to a promise. When Sundar had left India to study abroad, his mother had sung that same song the night before his flight. She told him, no matter where you go, never forget why you were there. You are not only carrying your dreams, Sundar, you are carrying ours too. He had promised her then, quietly, that he would never let success erase his roots. And yet, over the years, as his world became filled with boardrooms, investors, and global challenges, Sundar sometimes wondered if he had drifted too far from that promise. The song at the talent show wasn't just nostalgia, it was a reminder. A reminder that he still owed something, not just to his family, but to everyone who worked under him, many of whom carried stories of sacrifice just as heavy as his own thought. As he closed the notebook, Sundar thought about the engineers who had played the prank. Instead of anger, he felt something else, an opportunity. He realized they had unknowingly given him the stage to share what he had been holding back for years. Maybe it was time to reveal more than just his business vision. Maybe it was time to share the human story that could change how his employees saw themselves, their work, and their purpose. The following week, an email landed in everyone's inbox. It was simple, written in Sundar's usual understated way. Thank you for the support at the talent show. I know many of you still have questions about the song. I want to share the story behind it. Join me in the auditorium on Friday evening. The message spread like wildfire. Friday evening became the most anticipated event of the year. Employees speculated endlessly about what Sundar was going to say. Was it about a new initiative? Was he stepping down? Was it about his childhood? People rearranged meetings, canceled plans, and even invited family members who lived nearby. Friday came, and the auditorium was packed long before Sundar arrived. The same engineers who had played the prank sat nervously in the middle rows, trying not to draw attention. The intern from the front row sat again near the stage, heart pounding. Even the executives who normally skipped informal events were present, sitting stiffly with folded arms, hiding their curiosity. When Sundar walked in, the room erupted with applause. But this time, it wasn't polite or unsure it was filled. With genuine respect, Sundar waited for the sound to fade, then stepped to the microphone. He began softly, just like before. The song I sang last week, it is more than music. It is a part of my life. It is tied to nights of hunger, to moments when my family nearly lost everything, and to a promise I made long ago. The audience leaned forward, every heartbeat syncing with his words. Sundar's voice carried both strength and vulnerability as he began to tell the story of his childhood. He spoke of the one-room apartment, the nights when electricity was cut off, the silence broken only by his mother's song. He spoke of his father's long hours fixing machines, of the dignity and hard work even when the world refused to see. It got, and then he paused. His eyes scanned the room, and again they found the pranksters. But this time, instead of unease, his gaze carried warmth. What happened last week reminded me of something, he said. Sometimes we laugh at others without knowing what they carry. Sometimes we see only the surface. But every person in this room has a story, a struggle, a promise. And tonight, I want you to hear mine. The room was silent again, the kind of silence that feels alive, heavy with anticipation. Everyone knew what came next would not just be a story, it would be something that could change how they saw themselves, their leader, and their company forever. And just as Sundar opened his notebook to read aloud the words he had kept hidden, for years the lights in the auditorium flickered once, twice, then went completely dark. Gasps filled the room. Phones lit up as people instinctively reached for light. Murmurs of confusion spread. Some thought it was a technical issue. Others, however, felt something far heavier, that fate had just intervened at the exact moment Sundar was about to reveal the truth. Asterisk, the blackout lasted only seconds. But in those seconds, fear and tension gripped the entire auditorium. The sudden darkness swallowed everything, the faces, the stage, even the quiet hum of anticipation. People gasped, phones lit up in shaky hands, and uneasy laughter rippled across the room. For some, it was nothing more than a technical glitch, but for others, the timing was too perfect to ignore. Sundar had just opened his notebook, just as he was out to reveal the truth behind his song. When the lights went out, slowly, the emergency backup kicked in. Dim red lights along the walls flickered to life, painting the audience in shadows. The stage glowed faintly, and Sundar was still there, calm and unmoved. He held the notebook firmly in his hands, as though it was a lifeline. He couldn't afford to lose. A technician rushed forward, whispering nervously into a headset. Within minutes, the lights returned, flooding the room once again with brightness. The relief was visible on some faces, but the unease remained. Sundar didn't move during the chaos. When the lights stabilized, he looked around the room, then spoke softly into the microphone. "You see," he said, his voice steady, but carrying a weight that pressed on every ear. "Life is like this. Sometimes, just when you're ready to tell your story, the lights go out. Sometimes the world doesn't want you to speak. But when the lights return, you must decide whether to stay silent or continue." The words struck the audience like thunder. The blackout was no longer just an accident. It had become part of the story. Sundar opened the notebook again, his hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the memories he was about to release. "When I was a boy," he began, "my family lived in a small apartment in Chennai. We didn't have much, sometimes. Not even food, sometimes. Not even electricity. On those nights when the darkness came, my mother would hum this song. It was her way of saying, don't give up. Even when the world is dark, light will return." The audience sat in silence, hanging on every word. Some were employees who had grown up in privilege, who had never once worried about a meal or a bill. For them, Sundar's words opened a world they had never seen. Others, those who had come from difficult backgrounds, felt their hearts tighten. They knew exactly what he meant. He continued, "My father worked as an electrical engineer. He repaired machines in factories, often coming home late and tired. But he never complained. He told me once, the measure of a man is not in what he achieves when the lights are on, but how he endures when the lights go out. I never forgot that." As Sundar spoke, the pranksters who had signed him up for the performance shifted uncomfortably. Guilt burned deeper in their chests. They had mocked him, expecting to see him stumble, but instead, they were now hearing about hunger, sacrifice, and resilience from the man they thought they knew only as their CEO. But then Sundar paused. He closed the notebook again and looked at the audience, his eyes soft, yet piercing. "There's something else," he said, lowering his voice. "Something I never told anyone in this company. The song I sang that night. It was not just a lullaby. It was also the last thing my mother ever sang to me." A wave of shock rippled through the crowd. Whispers began immediately. Employees exchanged glances, eyes wide. Some covered their mouths, unable to believe what they had just heard. The intern in the front row felt his stomach twist, realizing that the performance wasn't just personal, it was deeply painful. Sundar continued, his voice catching for the first time. "I was in America when she fell ill. I was building my career, caught in meetings and deadlines. I thought I had time to go back, but one night I got a call. It was too late. She was gone. And the last thing my brother told me was that as she lay in bed, weak and fading, she hummed the same song. That was her goodbye." The room fell into complete silence. No one dared breathe too loudly. Sundar stood on stage, vulnerable in a way no one had ever seen. His eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but his voice held steady. "That day, I promised myself I would never forget. I promised I would use whatever success I had, not just for myself, but for others, for people like my mother who give everything and expect nothing. I promised I would carry her song with me into every room I ever entered. And that is the promise I was about to share with you." The weight of his words pressed down on everyone. Some employees were crying openly. Others bowed their heads in shame, thinking of how often they had laughed at him. underestimated him or taken their own families for granted, the pranksters could no longer even look up. Their plan had turned into a moment that cut straight through their arrogance, but Sundar wasn't done. He took a deep breath, then leaned closer to the microphone. What I am about to share with you is not just my story. It is something that will affect this company, this team, and perhaps even the world. It is the reason I never stopped working, never stopped believing. And it begins with the promise I made to my mother. Just then, a voice from the back of the auditorium called out loudly, breaking the silence. "Stop lying. You're only telling this story to make yourself look good." Gasps filled the room. Everyone turned to see who had spoken. It was one of the engineers, Rishi, the same man who had been part of the prank. His voice trembled, but his anger masked his fear. "You're the CEO of one of the biggest companies in the world. Don't pretend you know struggle like us. Don't pretend your song changes anything." The auditorium erupted in murmurs. Some employees shouted at him to sit down. Others stared in disbelief. Sundar, however, did not flinch. He simply looked at Rishi, his expression calm, his silence heavier than any words. "Come," Sundar finally said, gesturing gently. "Join me on stage." The room froze. Rishi's face paled, but the eyes of hundreds of people were now on him. Slowly, reluctantly, he stood and began to walk toward the stage, his heart racing. Everyone held their breath, waiting to see what Sundar would do. Would he humiliate the man? Would he punish him? Would he end the night with anger instead of grace? And just as Rishi reached the steps leading up to the stage, Sundar closed his notebook and whispered into the microphone. "You want the truth? Then let me show you." Asterisk, the room was so quiet that even the hum of the air conditioning seemed loud. Rishi stood frozen at the steps to the stage, his palms sweating, his heart pounding hard enough for him to feel it in his throat. He had never been the center of so much attention before, and now hundreds of eyes bore into him. Some looked at him with disgust, others with pity, but all of them waited to see what Sundar would do. Sundar extended his hand slowly, inviting Rishi onto the stage with a calmness that felt unshakable. Rishi hesitated. A part of him wanted to run back to his seat and disappear, but pride pushed him forward. He climbed the steps, each footstep heavier than the last, until he stood beside Sundar under the blinding stage lights. The CEO looked at him, not with anger, but with a softness that unsettled Rishi even more. "You think I don't know struggle?" Sundar said quietly, so that only Rishi at first could hear, though the microphone carried his words to everyone. "But the truth is, I see pieces of myself in you. I see the same doubt, the same anger, the same fire I once carried. I know because I lived it." Then Sundar turned back to the audience. "All of you look at me and see a title, CEO, leader, success story, but that is not the full truth. The truth is much harder to accept. The truth is, I almost gave up long before I ever got here." A murmur rippled through the audience. Sundar rarely spoke about himself in such raw terms. His usual talks were about innovation, vision, technology, and never about weakness, never about almost giving up. He opened his notebook again, his fingers brushing over a page that looked older than the rest. Its edges worn, as if he had read it hundreds of times. "I was 17, he began. I had just finished school. My father wanted me to study engineering, but we had no money for college. He tried everything, borrowing, pleading with relatives, working extra hours, but it wasn't enough. One night, I overheard my parents whispering in the kitchen. My mother cried, saying she didn't want me to give up my education. My father said, maybe he should just get a job. Maybe dreams are too expensive for people like us. I sat in the dark, listening, and for the first time I felt my future slipping away. The room held its breath. Sundar's voice had no theatrics, no performance. It was simply truth, stripped bare. That night, I thought about quitting. I thought maybe my life was meant to be small, that maybe greatness belonged to others, not to me. I even wrote a letter to my parents saying I would stop studying, that I would work in a factory to help with bills. I nearly gave it to them the next morning. Sundar's eyes lowered, his voice dropping. But before I could, my mother placed her hand on mine and hummed that same song. She looked at me and said, "Don't you dare give up. If we have to starve, we will. But you will not give up your dream." The audience was spellbound. Some employees had tears rolling silently down their cheeks. The pranksters, including Kabia, who sat trembling in her seat, felt their shame multiply. They had thought it was funny to put Sundar's name down for a joke. Now they realized they had triggered a story that was teaching them more about resilience than any motivational seminar ever. "Res," I stood beside Sundar, speechless. The anger he had shouted earlier melted into something else, regret and even admiration. He had accused Sundar of pretending, but now he saw the raw pain in the man's eyes. Sundar closed the notebook and looked at Rishi directly. "You think I can't understand you? But I know what it feels like to be invisible, to feel the world doesn't care about your struggle. I know what it feels like to laugh at others, to hide your own pain. I was you once. The only difference is that someone believed in me before I believed in myself. And now it is my responsibility to believe in you." Gasp filled the room. No one had expected Sundar to respond with kindness, especially after being challenged so openly. Instead of shaming Rishi, he had chosen to lift him up, to show him that even his flaws, his anger, his doubts, were part of a story worth redeeming. But then Sundar's tone shifted, heavier, more urgent. He stepped forward, his voice carrying power. "But I must tell you something else," he said. "Something I have never shared publicly. My mother's song, the one I sang last week. It is not just my memory. It is also a message she asked me to carry to the world. Before she died, she made me promise that one day I would use my voice, not my position, not my wealth, but my voice to remind people of their own strength. To remind them that even in darkness, they carry light." The auditorium felt electric. Sundar's words struck deep, not just as a story, but as a challenge. He turned back to Rishi. "So, when you say my story doesn't change anything, you're wrong? Because tonight, I am not just telling you my story. I am reminding you of yours. Each of you has a song, a promise, a fire. The question is, will you carry it, or will you let it die?" The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Sundar's gaze swept across the room, landing on faces that looked stunned, tearful, or deeply thoughtful. Then he looked back at Rishi, who stood with trembling lips, unsure what to say. Finally, Rishi's voice cracked as he whispered, I'm sorry." But Sundar shook his head gently. "Don't be sorry. Be better. Let this moment be the beginning, not the end." Applause erupted, louder than it had ever been at any company gathering. People stood, clapping, some shouting his name, others simply crying in silence. Sundar, however, did not bask in the applause. He simply lowered his eyes and stepped back from the microphone, his hand still resting on the notebook. And just when it seemed like the night had reached its peak, Sundar raised his head again, his face serious. "But you should know," he said, his voice calm but sharp. "The reason I chose to sing that night wasn't just to honor my mother. It was because of something happening right now, something inside this very company that reminds me of the same darkness I once lived through. And I cannot stay silent anymore." The clapping stopped instantly. Tension snapped back into the room. People exchanged nervous glances, trying to guess what he meant. Was it about layoffs? Corruption? A hidden truth no one had dared to say aloud. Sundar's eyes scanned the crowd one final time. "There is something you need to hear, and it will change how you see this company. And me, asterisk the air inside." The auditorium grew heavy, so thick that people felt as though they were breathing through silence itself. Sundar stood tall, but his eyes betrayed the weight he carried. His words hung in the room like a storm cloud. "There's something happening right now inside this company that I can no longer stay silent about." The executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging quick glances. They were not used to surprises from Sundar. He was known for being calm, methodical, careful with words. But tonight he had abandoned that caution. Tonight, He looked like a man ready to unearth something that others might have buried deep. Employees leaned forward, their hearts racing. Some feared layoffs, others feared scandals. The pranksters who had begun this entire chain of events sat rigid, feeling the tension coil tighter and tighter. Rishi, still standing beside Sundar, felt his throat dry. He realized now that he had stepped into something far larger than his outburst. Sundar opened his notebook again, but this time he didn't read from it. Instead, he placed it gently on the podium, as if setting aside a shield. He wanted to speak without the safety of notes. I see the people in this room, he began, his voice steady, and I see talent, brilliance, creativity, but I also see exhaustion in your eyes. I see fear that you cannot speak your truth. I see people who feel invisible, and that is my fault. A murmur spread across the audience. Never had a CEO admitted fault so openly, so publicly. Sundar continued, when I was young, my mother's song gave me strength in the darkest times. But here, inside these walls, I know there are people fighting their own darkness alone. People who have dreams but are too afraid to share them. People who are silenced, mocked, or dismissed. And I cannot allow that. The words sliced through the audience. Some employees immediately thought of recent stories, times when junior voices had been ignored, when bold ideas were laughed off, when quiet workers were overlooked in favor of louder ones. For the first time, those unspoken truths felt like they had been given a voice. Sundar's gaze fell on the pranksters, not with anger, but with something deeper. When you wrote my name down as a joke, it reminded me of something I had forgotten. How it feels to be underestimated. How it feels to be laughed at before you even try. That pain, that silence exists here too. And if it can happen too, me, the CEO, imagine how often it happens to those with no title, no protection. The pranksters lowered their heads. Shame burned like fire in their chests. They hadn't just played a harmless trick, they had exposed a wound, one that stretched across the company. But Sundar wasn't finished. His voice deepened, carrying urgency. There's a story I need to tell you, he said. A story not about my past, but about someone among you. Someone who came to me in private weeks ago with tears in their eyes. They told me they had been mocked by colleagues for their accent, excluded from projects, left to feel worthless. They said they didn't think they belonged here, that maybe they should quit. And do you know what gave them courage to stay? He paused. The audience leaned forward, waiting, their hearts pounding. They told me, Sundar continued, that they remembered my mother's story from an interview years ago. They remembered how she kept singing even when there was no food, no light. They told me if she didn't give up, I won't either. That is why they are still here today. But I promised them something. I promised them I would speak their truth for them. I promised I would not let this company be a place where someone's voice is silenced. Gasps filled the room. Everyone turned to each other, wondering who that employee was. Was it someone sitting among them right now? The executives looked uneasy, suddenly realizing Sundar was calling out the culture of their own workplace, exposing the quiet cruelty that thrived in the shadows. Then Sundar stepped away from the podium, his voice raw. So tonight I keep my promise. I tell you this, from this day forward, no voice in this company is too small to be heard. No story is too unimportant. If my mother's song could survive hunger and darkness, then your voices can survive fear. But you must have the courage to use them. Because if you don't, then we will lose more than business. We will lose our humanity. The room erupted into thunderous applause. People stood again, clapping not just for Sundar, but for themselves. For the feeling that maybe, just maybe, their stories mattered too. Some employees cried openly, hugging each other. Others nodded silently, carrying their own hidden stories in their hearts, feeling seen for the first time. But amid the applause, one person in the audience didn't move. Kaudia, one of the pranksters, sat frozen. Her face had gone pale. She looked at Sundar with wide eyes, as though his words had pierced directly into her chest. Rishi noticed her trembling hands. She whispered so quietly only those beside her could hear. He's talking about me. The applause still roared, but those words sent chills through the few who heard them. Could it be true? Was Kavya the one Sundar was speaking about? Was she the employee who had come to him in tears, mocked for her accent, ready to quit? And if so, why had she been part of the very prank that had nearly humiliated him? The applause faded, but the tension remained. Sundar looked out over the crowd, his expression unreadable, as if he already knew that someone's truth was about to surface in a way no one expected. Asterisk, the applause slowly faded into silence, leaving only the sound of quiet breathing in the auditorium. Sundar stood at the center of the stage, his hand resting gently on his notebook, his face calm but unreadable. The weight of his last words still pressed on the room. But now all eyes began to shift toward Kavya. Her trembling voice, "He's talking about me," had not gone unnoticed. Those closest to her stared in shock, some whispering, others stunned into stillness. I turned to her, confusion mixing with guilt. "What do you mean?" He whispered, but Kavya couldn't answer. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, as though her secret had finally clawed its way to the surface, refusing to stay hidden any longer. Finally, Sundar broke the silence. "Perhaps," he said softly, "it is time the person I spoke of finds the courage to tell their own story." His eyes scanned the crowd, and then deliberately they settled on Kavya. The entire room turned. Kavya's face flushed. Tears welled in her eyes. She wanted to vanish, but the spotlight felt fixed on her, even though no beam of light pointed her way. For a moment, she tried to shake her head, to pretend, to hide. But then Sundar spoke again, with such gentleness that it disarmed her completely. "Kavya," he said, "the stage is yours." The sound of her name from his lips hit her like a wave. She froze, her hands clutching the edge of her chair. Hundreds of people stared, waiting. She thought about running, about burying everything deeper inside. But then she remembered the night she had sat in Sundar's office, her voice shaking as she admitted she felt invisible, ridiculed for her accent, for her background, for not being polished enough in meetings. She remembered the way Sundar had listened without interrupting, his quiet nods assuring her that her pain mattered. She remembered his promise. "One day, you won't need me to speak for you. One day, you will speak for yourself." Her body shook as she stood. The walk to the aisle felt endless, her knees weak, her throat dry. As she stepped forward, the audience hushed. The sound of her footsteps echoed louder than applause ever could. She climbed the stage stairs slowly, and for the first time in years, she stood in front of her colleagues not as someone mocked, not as someone hiding, but as herself. She took the microphone from Sundar with trembling hands. Her lips quivered. Silence wrapped around her. Then she spoke, her voice fragile, but growing stronger with every word. "It's true," she began, her eyes glistening. "I was the one who went to Sundar. I was the one who cried in his office, telling him I didn't belong here. I've been mocked for my accent, ignored in meetings, laughed at when I made mistakes. I felt small, so small that I almost quit." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Many had no idea this had been happening. Some glanced at one another, ashamed, remembering moments when they might have contributed to the same culture of dismissal. Kavya's voice broke, but she forced herself to continue. "That night, Sundar told me his mother's story. He told me about her song. He said, 'Your voice may shake, but it is still your voice, and it matters.' That's why I stayed. But, and this is the hardest part, even after all that, I still let my fear control me. I joined in the prank. I thought if I laughed at him first, then no one would laugh at me. I betrayed the very person who believed in me." Gasps spread across the audience. Rishi's mouth fell open. Guilt stabbed him harder now. Realizing Kavya's participation in the prank had not come from cruelty, but from a desperate attempt to hide her own wounds, Kavya wiped her eyes, her voice trembling but fierce. "I am sorry, Sundar. I am sorry. To all of you, I was weak. But tonight, I want to be honest. I don't want to hide anymore. The silence that followed was heavy, but not cruel. It was a silence filled with reflection, with empathy, with the recognition of shared humanity. Sundar stepped closer, placing his hand gently on her shoulder. You are not weak, he said softly, though the microphone carried his words across the hall. You are brave. Bravery is not about never falling, it is about standing again. When you do, and tonight you stood, the audience erupted. This time, the applause wasn't just for Sundar, it was for Kavya. People rose to their feet, clapping, some even shouting her name. Tears streamed down her face, but for the first time, they weren't tears of shame, they were tears of release, of freedom, of dignity reclaimed. Sundar let the applause continue before raising his hand gently, signaling for calm. When the room quieted, he spoke again, his voice carrying the weight of a closing chapter and the promise of a new beginning. This is why I sang that night. He said, not to show talent, not to entertain, but to remind us that every voice carries a story, and every story deserves respect. Leadership is not about being above others. It is about lifting them when they stumble, believing in them when they doubt, and listening when the world refuses to hear. My mother's song was never just for me. It was for all of us. The words struck deep. Employees wiped tears, executives bowed their heads, and even Rishi, once defiant now, clapped with sincerity, his heart pounding with the realization of how wrong he had been. Sundar closed his notebook one last time and placed it on the podium. Tonight, he said, I have kept my promise to my mother. But now each of you has a promise to keep. Ask yourself, whose voice will you listen to? Whose story will you honor? Because the true measure of this company is not in our products, not in our profits, but in how we treat the people who sit beside us. The auditorium erupted in the loudest standing ovation of the night. Not because of power or fear or obligation, but because every person in the room had been moved, changed, and reminded of something greater than themselves. Kavya wept openly, holding onto the microphone, while Sundar placed a reassuring hand on her back. Rishi clapped until his palm stung, his heart swelling with a determination to do better. The intern in the front row cried quietly, thinking of his own mother, and whispering a silent promise that he would carry her sacrifices with him always. As Sundar stepped away from the stage, he looked up briefly, as though gazing beyond the ceiling itself, and whispered under his breath a single sentence only he could hear. I kept my promise. And with that, the story that began as a joke ended as something unforgettable, a lesson in humility, resilience, respect, and kindness that no one in that room would ever forget. Asterisk,